My name is Martha Thompson. I'm a professor emeritus of sociology and women and gender studies at Northeastern Illinois University in Chicago. And I'm also an impact and an empowerment self-defense instructor. And I almost said ESD there because but I first want to explain, we're probably all going to say ESD at one point or another. That's really the acronym we use for empowerment self-defense. I've invited 6 empowerment self-defense experts to join me today to make this case for why feminists need to advocate for empowerment self-defense. You're going to meet each of them. You see 2 of them are sitting right next to me already, and I will introduce them in a few minutes. But first I want to say the first reason for why we need to advocate for empowerment self-defense. What we know from the research, number 1, women trained in empowerment self-defense stop sexual violence. This is why I am so passionate about doing this work, because it works. I want to start with just reading you a quote from one of my students, and this could really be a student from any of us. One of my male acquaintances tended to be a bit handsy when drinking. On one occasion, I told him to quit touching me. He laughed. With that, I turned, put my hands into a defensive stance and said, I am setting a boundary. You are not respecting it. Stop now. His smirk melted off his face. After that, keeping his hands to himself was never an issue again. This is an example, just one story that's an example of what the research is showing. That women who have taken empowerment self-defense are less likely to experience unwanted sexual advances than women who have not. Also, a really big finding that has really reinforced our work is that women who've taken empowerment self-defense are less likely to be raped. Reducing the rate of rape by 50%. This is major. This is significant. Empowerment self-defense works. I want to bring in other voices at this point. Right over here is Julie Harmon. Julie has a Ph.D. in psychology. She's the director of impact safety in Columbus, Ohio. She's got 30 years of teaching empowerment self-defense. And here is Mona McDonald, nationally certified self-defense instructor and the co-founder of Lioness Martial Arts in Pittsburgh. What they're going to talk about are what is it that makes empowerment self-defense distinctive? What does it bring to the table? And also, what is it that people are learning in empowerment self-defense classes? So Julie.
So Martha, thank you. What I'm going to share with you are several of the principles that are the underpinnings of empowerment self-defense. There are many, but we don't have time for them all. So as Martha talked about, empowerment self-defense is grounded in research, in data, in evidence about violence, about sexual assault, and for our outcomes tested in many other related fields like mental health. So that's really important because we've done the hard work of figuring out why it works and that it does work. The first principle is that sexual assault and sexual violence is seen as a social problem. What this means is that people are viewed as people are able to understand what we teach at a both personal and contextual level, and that responses are based on individual choice. For example, as Martha used that example about the handsy person, another example might be somebody who you know and love, and they hug and kiss you. you may not have any problems with. If that same behavior is from a stranger at a party, your response may be different. Or better yet, if that same behavior or unwanted advance is from someone you know really well, that may warrant a different response. So choice and context is considered. Another principle is that ESD clearly recognizes that the aggressor is always responsible for their behavior. They are responsible for verbal threats, they are responsible for harassment, they are responsible for physical threats, they are responsible for sexual assault. And that the aggressor is absolutely held accountable for their behavior. The third principle that also is acknowledged and supported by research is that the majority of assaults are committed by somebody we know, by people familiar to us, people that we often love, respect, like, revere, and we never ever expect them to behave that way. The fourth principle is that ESD is grounded in a trauma-informed approach, which means that we consider trauma and systems of oppression when we are planning and teaching our classes. The impact of understanding trauma and oppression guides the way that classes are implemented, the skills taught, and the discussions that we have. The fifth principle is that ESD, empowerment self-defense, recognizes the power of the group. We utilize a peer support methodology, which means that there is sincere support for people taking risks, making difficult choices, taking ownership of their lives and their bodies, and making difficult choices. The peer support helps that commitment stay rooted in the person once they leave the class. Now, Mona is going to talk about how these principles translate into teaching outcomes of empowerment self-defense programs.
When I talk about self-defense, a lot of people think about kicking and punching your way out of a situation. But empowerment self-defense is actually a lot more than that. With empowerment self-defense, we teach a range of skills and strategies to our students so that they leave with options that they can use in their everyday lives, not just in a very dangerous situation, but in a whole range of situations that people face every day. We want to prepare students with as many different tools as we can so that they can respond appropriately in whatever situation they're facing, whether that's a low-level kind of situation, unwanted attention, for example, or all the way up through an actual physical assault. We provide accurate information and knowledge to our students. Where are the risks? Where the risks come from? And how are we targeted? These are all really important things for people to understand. We also talk about the latest research and what that shows so that people are prepared with knowledge. We teach awareness skills. That includes environmental awareness of the external environment. It also includes intuition, which is a powerful tool for self-defense and staying safe. We teach people how to read body language, how to recognize boundary crossings. These are also really valuable skills for people to stay safe. Students learn to use their voices effectively. And again, we deal with voice in a lot of different ways. We teach people to speak assertively, to actually be very clear in what they want and what they don't want. Boundary setting skills, very powerful tool. We teach de-escalation skills, which gives people the ability to bring the level of something down so it doesn't escalate into violence. We teach effective physical skills as well, of course. And we use these as a last resort. We make the skills accessible to all different kinds of people, different body types, different abilities. We use our most powerful tools on our body against the most vulnerable targets on a human body, thereby leveling the playing field and making the physical moves very effective. And lastly, but not least, we provide resources for healing and support. This is very, very important and something that is specific to empowerment self-defense.
Thank you, Mona and Julie. So just to remind you, this is in support of our #1 reason for why empowerment self-defense is important to advocate for. It works. And as Julie and Mona have said, it works because of its principles and the content that we offer. At this point, I'm going to ask Carmel and Anne to come join us. And thanks, Julie and Mona. Of course, as we just said, principles and content are very, very important. But another major reason to support empowerment self-defense, to advocate for it, is because of the spaces we build in the classroom. That ESD builds spaces of agency, of power, and support. So we're not just principles and content, but we are very much emphasizing the environment, the teaching situation. We want to bring in, again, another voice of a student, just to set the stage for this. We were a group of 15 strangers with decades between our ages and wild differences in our lives and experiences. But we came together to create a space full of support, generosity, and kindness. Every one of the women in the class shared her focus, determination, and strength with me. And one of the reasons I feel so much stronger is because I went through the experience with them. I'm going to ask Anne and Carmel to talk about what makes these spaces so important and how do we create them. Anne, if you'd start, please.
Sure, thank you, Martha. We're creating a space where for perhaps the first time, our participants, many of us are teaching women and girls in particular, have an opportunity to explore some very difficult and sometimes taboo subjects like sexual assault and personal safety and violence, and have a way of understanding it and discussing it in an environment that's supportive of survivors of violence, where we aren't blaming one another for what has happened to us in the past, or where we're encouraged to have compassion for ourselves and for other women. So I think one of the most powerful things that we do in our classrooms is set up a framework for understanding violence, our socialization to not always have the tools that we need to protect ourselves. We really give people a vocabulary for understanding and validating their everyday experiences. And that improves their confidence in their own perceptions of reality. We describe violence as we understand it as it happening on a continuum from irritating to scary to life-threatening. So it can include situations like street harassment, like somebody not accepting our no when we want to set a boundary, like cat calls or sexual harassment in the workplace that could affect us financially. So we have a whole range that we incorporate under our umbrella. And then we teach people a range of tools for responding to this. So rather than we teach verbal skills, we teach boundary setting, we teach physical skills, as was mentioned previously. So people leave our classes with an understanding and a vocabulary to talk about something that they may not have been able to talk about in the past. So they're feeling, I feel less helpless, more effective, and that they can expand their lives in new ways because they can, navigate that fear that we feel sometimes out in the world. We're also helping people to let go of the shame or blame that they may be carrying around for maybe not having had tools and for the types of responses that they may have felt like to violence that has happened in their past that they may be feeling badly about. We support whatever choices people have made in order to get to this point, and that may also be an experience they haven't really had out in the rest of their lives. And we encourage people to get support beyond the class when they need to. So by having compassion towards ourselves and then putting the anger where it belongs, like towards the perpetrator, and then taking that out beyond the classroom out into the world, we are creating change. We're creating more open communication within families, between mothers and daughters who've taken these classes together, between like community members who've taken these classes together so that they can, make real changes out in their communities. And by creating these spaces where women and girls have experienced power in their bodies and in their voices, they now have more skills to take out into their lives and the ability to deliver consequences to folks who may attempt to harm them. In a world where there often aren't a lot of consequences for sexual violence and other types of violence, that can create real change. When you give somebody a consequences, they may be less likely to try and perpetrate that behavior again in the future. So we feel pretty good about that. We're not only changing the women and girls, but we're changing the behavior of people who may be attempting to harm them and other women in the future, because it doesn't become an easy thing anymore. So we're trying to project change out on a cultural level.
I'm going to speak a little bit about the ways that we integrate the concepts that Julie mentioned earlier into our teaching and into our classrooms to create the safe spaces that Anne referenced. The two things I'm going to talk to you about are being trauma-informed and being aware of intersectionality and the complexity of people's experiences in the world. So when we say that we're trauma-informed, it means that we're aware that people in our classes have experienced some level of trauma. That could be a single incident, very severe trauma. It could be pervasive, lower level traumas that they go through in their lives. And it could be secondary trauma. We work with a lot of folks who work with survivors and work in counseling areas and work with people who themselves have been in those more severe trauma situations. So because of that, we utilize ideas of personal agency throughout our classes. We give people lots of options. We make it very normal to observe, to learn through observation rather than actually doing something. We start with a very light grab. We give people the power to say, you're the one that tells your partner when to grab you more strongly when we're practicing this exercise, because you can practice it very well without it being something that is a sudden shock or potentially re-triggering to someone who has been grabbed before and had that be very scary for them. We also have an increased understanding in the clinical world of the ways that trauma is experienced. And trauma is really not experienced in the thinking and talking part of our brain. When we're in a traumatic experience, the part of our brain and the part of our body that reacts is the part that is meant to run away, fight the bear, freeze up and hide. And so it's not really the thinking part. So in clinical work, we're integrating more somatic and experiential components in trauma healing. And in empowerment self-defense, we are also doing the same. We are giving people opportunities to replay moments in their lives where they have not felt that they had power, and we're giving them the opportunity to have a very different experience, whether that's saying no to a colleague who really wants you to work for them next weekend when you don't want to, or whether it's striking someone in the face when they're trying to pin you up against the wall. Being able to have those times that we can redo it in our bodies, redo it with our voices, gives us a healing component from past traumas or even the fear of a potential future trauma. We also, as instructors, being trauma-informed means that we look around our classes. We look for signs that people are shutting down, potentially being re-triggered, or that they're being highly activated, that we see their energy levels go up. And so we know ways to quickly switch gears and lead a breathing or grounding exercise. We're going to reconnect. We're going to feel our feet on the floor. We're going to hold on to something and feel the weight of that in our hands. We're going to close our eyes and listen to the sounds that we hear in the room. And these are things that help people re-regulate their neurological systems and be able to get back into the exercises and things that we're doing in the course of a workshop. We're also careful about calibrating. We start at lower levels, we build up to things that are more intense, and then we come back down from that so that people have and are guided through a process of encountering the things that, like I said, may pull on past traumas or may just be more scary because they seem like a dangerous thing that could happen. And then we guide them back into that feeling of safety. It's in a very intentional and careful way with our participants. The other way that we make our spaces safe is that we're aware of intersectionality. Our primary focus in empowerment self-defense is working around gender-based violence, but we know that people live in a world that's full of other oppressions. It's full of racism, it's full of classism, it's full of transphobia, ableism, and all of the other forces that are at work that impact the people that come to our classes, the people that they encounter out in the world, and that also impact us as instructors. So we know about those things, we're knowledgeable. We acknowledge that people are their own experts about their experience, that communities are the experts about the things that they face and the way that all of those oppressions interact. We do our best to avoid situations where we might misstep and assume that what is true for me is also true for you in a very different situation or context. But we can't always avoid those missteps, and we are ready and we have the training and skills to handle them when they happen, to really listen, to truly hear from the people who we are working with in order to help repair those, be able to do a better job next time. Thanks.
Thank you. And I forgot to introduce these two folks. I think you can hear how well they spoke about these topics, that they've got a lot behind it, but let me tell you a little bit about them. Ann Kuzminsky is a nationally certified self-defense instructor, and she teaches in Rhode Island. Carmel Drews is the founder of Empowerment Changes in Massachusetts. She has 15 years of empowerment self-defense experience and teaching, and she is also a clinical social worker specializing in healing trauma. And thank you, Ann and Carmel. Thank you. Just to remind you that the number 2 reason that we want all of us to be advocating for empowerment self-defense is because we build spaces of agency, power, and support. And those are just not available everywhere. So we encourage you to remember item number 2, reason number 2. The number 3 reason, before I say what it is, I want to just say a little background, is as empowerment self-defense instructors, we often hear, and often from feminists who are our allies, that our focus should be on challenging rape culture, not on self-defense. And I think our number 3 reason of why we should be advocating for empowerment self-defense is that it's not, that we do challenge rape culture. That we, first of all, we see challenging rape culture and offering empowerment self-defense is 2 things that can be happening. It's not one or the other. And that not only do we see empowerment self-defense is part of just creating more safety for women, but that we also see it as a means of challenging rape culture. I want to read you a 3rd quote from a student addressing sort of how this, she doesn't speak particularly about rape culture, but I think you'll hear how the class affected her in terms of her thinking. This was a surprisingly profound experience. It shifted the way I view the world. My expectations of individuals and societies, as well as my questions on how they work. I expect more now. I ask more critical questions, and that makes all the difference. And to really speak to how that makes all the difference and how we are challenging rape culture, I've been joined by Amy Jones, who is an NWMAF, and that's National Women's Martial Arts Federation, certified instructor. And she's also the program manager of violence prevention and self-defense at Thousand Waves Martial Arts and Self-Defense Center. And also Clara Porter, who is the director of Prevention Action Change in Massachusetts. And I should say Amy is one of my colleagues from Chicago. I forgot to mention where she was from. But back to Clara. She's in Massachusetts, the director of Prevention Action Change. And she has extensive experiences in working with universities on gender-based violence. And we're going to hear from both of them about different things regarding rape culture and how empowerment self-defense is involved in challenging it. So Amy, if we could start with you.
Of course. So rape culture is the ways that sexual violence is trivialized and is normalized in our culture. And confession, I don't love the term rape culture because I feel like when people first hear it, they think it's about a culture where everyone's a rapist. And it's more subtle than that, you know, and it's insidious because it's mostly invisible. I think that one of the most powerful things about empowerment self-defense is that it sort of makes that visible. It positions a rape joke as a form of violence. It's on a continuum, a spectrum of violence. It's not overt physical violence. It doesn't warrant an overt physical response, but it is a kind of violence and it can be defended against. And we also teach in empowerment self-defense that small forms of violence build. So they don't always, the rape joke doesn't always turn into rape, but it's an early warning sign. And so we ask people to pay attention to those early warning signs as a way of preventing the bigger stuff, right? So, you know, if someone makes a rape joke, maybe they're just going for shock value and a cheap laugh. So if someone texts me 300 times a day, maybe they're just really enthusiastic and excited. But if I tell them that the rape joke makes me uncomfortable, or I tell them to stop texting me, and they respond with dismissiveness, they respond with defensiveness, they've now told me that they don't really care about what I want. They care about what they want. And that is dangerous. That is a danger sign. And so when people can notice that, then they can keep their distance from that person, be wary. That is what the way the verbal skills that are very minor and they're not minor, but they are low level, and that can prevent the emergency, right? So physical and sexual violence doesn't come from nowhere. It does not erupt out of a vacuum. You know, even stranger attacks, there is a testing process. But the statistic that many of us are familiar with is that most sexual violence comes from people that we know, the vast majority. When you think about it, that's terrifying. That's a terrifying idea that one day someone's completely normal and the next day they're going to rape you. I mean, how do you live with that? You can't. But the power of ESD training is that it helps you notice that completely when it seems a small issue, but it's not quite completely normal before it escalates. And sometimes it doesn't work. Sometimes you miss the signals. Sometimes you just decide to ignore the signals. You decide to take that risk. And that's where the physical skills come from, or come in, rather. You know, we teach skills that are easy to learn, and they're going to work against someone who's bigger, meaner, and stronger than you. Not in a fair fight, but we're not talking about a fair fight. We're talking about disabling someone long enough that you can get away. And sometimes that doesn't work. Nothing works all the time. Or more commonly, you're not willing to do that because it's someone you know. So we also teach that strategic compliance is valid, that there's nothing that you can do, say, think, wear, believe, drink, whatever, that ever makes it your fault that someone else chose to attack you. I think one of the biggest things that empowerment self-defense does is it gives you choice and it gives you agency, and that fosters resilience. You know, even if the worst happens, if you have a framework where you had choices and you chose the best thing for you in that moment, that is going to make your healing process be a little bit easier. So it challenges rape culture in that it helps you see rape culture and it helps you defend against it before it becomes a rape. So, yeah, Clara?
You know, looking at these issues of rape culture on college campuses is particularly challenging. There have been really deep efforts over the last 8 to 10 years on the part of the Obama administration, college administrations, staff, faculty, and most notably students on college campuses and student organizations to really impact rape culture. And they have made some really great strides. The challenges that unfortunately sexual violence is still normalized on many college campuses and among certain populations on college campuses. You'll be doing a workshop on a college campus, and certainly there's broad agreement that rape is bad. We can all agree upon that. However, the sort of classic college scenario that still is all too common of the drunkest woman in a room being targeted, being plied with more alcohol, removed from the social situation, and raped is not seen by many as rape. It's seen as a normal occurrence on a college campus. And that's compounded by the fact of victim blaming. So again, all too often, the person who's targeted for that violence will be blamed, at least in part, for the attack that they experienced. So this is what we're up against, all of us in all these different fields trying to impact change on college campuses. Empowerment self-defense is really the only intervention that dramatically reduces the incidence of sexual violence on college campuses. We have the data, we know the evidence. Martha brought it up in the beginning of this seminar, where we've seen a 50% reduction in attempted and completed sexual assault. There's nothing else that even comes close. And I think, you know, that's on the individual lives of the participants in empowerment self-defense programs, but the ripple effects of what they have learned and the changes in their own ways of moving through the world is very significant, and I think has a deep impact on rape culture in their college campuses. Students learn to recognize the precursors of sexual violence and so prevent it from happening. They receive training in setting boundaries and expressing what they want, need, and feel in a variety of situations, and they gain practice and increase their own confidence in speaking up and acting when those boundaries are not respected. This impacts all aspects of their lives, and it has real ripple effects from their own individual experience, whether that be from their peers in the dorm or in the classroom or at a job, and it really ripples out to the entire campus. Their campus change efforts are multi-pronged, and they need to be, and empowerment self-defense is one part of that. They include things like campus-wide messaging and advocacy and awareness campaigns, education, policy changes, judicial changes. All of these have been in the news significantly, and they all play an important part, including survivor supports on campuses, particularly peer supports. Some of the key elements to making these interventions work are how we work with men. So treating men as allies. You know, we know that the majority of sexual violence is perpetrated by men, but we also know that the vast majority of men will never perpetrate sexual violence. So what's their role? Their role is that of a peer, of a support, of an active bystander, of someone who can influence the behavior of other men. And so it's a very, very important role. We also need to really work to meet men and other allies where they are. So we can't have the expectation that from any of our work that all, allies and men are going to turn into advocates and march with us and take back the night rallies. Some may just find a rape joke a little less funny, and that's progress. So we need to meet people where they are and move them along the road towards understanding what sexual violence is and how to prevent it campus-wide. All of these interventions have a role to play in changing campus culture and climate and impacting rape culture. While significant strides have been made in impacting the attitudes and some of the behaviors on campus, there's little evidence that these interventions have actually reduced the incidence of sexual violence on campuses. The only thing that we know works in reducing sexual violence is empowerment self-defense.
Okay, so thank you, Clara, and thank you, Amy. Really, thank you to all of the experts who joined us. Want to thank you, Deet, as well for organizing the webinars. And thanks to all of you who are sitting here with us in this room and those of you who are joining us remotely. It really means a lot to have that support and have you listening to us. Just want to recap those 3 reasons for feminists to advocate for empowerment self-defense. Number 1, it works to stop violence. Empowerment self-defense builds those very important spaces of agency, power, and support. And as we've just heard, empowerment self-defense not only is working to keep women safe and all people safe, but it challenges rape culture. And we're really asking all of you out there joining us remotely, everybody in this room, to join us in changing the culture, in holding those who commit violence, holding them responsible for it, and in supporting people in increasing their own safety and without blame. Thank you very much.
So I'm gonna ask if there are any questions from our people here in the room with us, because I haven't yet gotten one on the chat. Ellen, I'll repeat it, or unless you want to take a mic.
What are some of the key things that you think need to happen for empowerment self-defense to reach women more broadly in the United States and other countries, but focus on the United States at this time?
So the question is, what are the actions that need to happen in order to make empowerment self-defense more available and reach more women? Let's start with the US, but if anyone wants to talk about global, we could do that too.
Okay, any folks want to jump in? Clara.
I'll speak to the college campus situation. For quite a while, empowerment self-defense or any self-defense training was not accepted by the Department of Justice, who often funds anti-rape and sexual violence prevention programming on college campuses. We've done a lot of work in presenting the research to them and providing them with the data, and they have heard us. So our hope, of course, is that this will course a change, that this will allow an opening for empowerment self-defense training to happen on college campuses. And there's some replication of some work that was done in Canada and the research behind that. That's already happening in our country. So we're really hoping to see a broad expansion in that soon. Does anybody else want to speak to that?
Udit, if you might want to speak to this ESD Global.
So I think one of the hopes and some of the work that we've done this past week here in upstate New York has been, how do we organize a network of resources that we can make both scalable and sustainable by giving the resources that are needed and by giving by making noise. And I think the key to making this global and making this what it should be, that all people have accessibility to empowerment self-defense, no matter where they are, is achievable. And but it will take a lot of grit and determination and working together. And I look forward to that happening. We have a question from Ellen Snortland. Has anyone successfully used Title IX to fund ESD courses on campus?
Anybody else? In the last year, I was funded through one of the campus grants to provide self-defense training on a college campus. Yes, I haven't seen that it's been integrated into a grant that was presented to the feds for funding. So I haven't seen it there where it's clearly in the grant and takes a good chunk of the budget to provide these services. But I know that some of that funding is being then used, once it's funded, it is being used to provide services by outside providers.
And I'm not going to speak directly to that, but I do think all of us face the challenge that we have relationships with maybe an individual campus or an individual organization that supports us. And that's often because we have a relationship with a single person who supports the work we do. And I think the challenge I see that we need to be able to jump from this individual support to just broader support, that it becomes a standard in universities, for example, which it is not right now, to offer self-defense programming, that it becomes a standard in domestic violence and sexual assault work, that self-defense, empowerment self-defense is connected. And right now, I think almost all of us, where we work depends upon a relationship with somebody who really believes in the work, that it's not a systemic, we don't have systemic access.
So another question from Wendy Dragonfire. Do others among you also teach when teaching about the isms, how we sometimes are unmeaning perpetrators and how we can change that?
Somebody, Julie, or Meg, you want to answer?
You got to step up to
Carmel, yeah.
Just sit on your lap, Clara. But I'll ask permission first. Is that okay?
Right, yes.
I can speak to that. I would say, yeah, we do. I think it's very hard it has to be sort of intentional to ignore the other factors of oppression when you're learning about pervasive rape culture and violence on a spectrum, and then to pretend like that spectrum doesn't also exist for the other isms. I mean, we point that out in our classes and we bring that to people's attention, and we try to make connections between the ways that people do things not meaning to, that cross their boundaries on a physical level in terms of contact, or a physical level in terms of respecting a no, and that those same things can happen in regards to other factors of oppression, other isms. So as we're asking people to be more aware of that within the context of gender-based violence, we're asking them to be more aware of that in the context of a cisnormative society, where we assume that people's genders are ours to decide by looking at them rather than connecting with them. And when we make a mistake, saying, oh, I'm sorry that I did that, and trying to do better next time. The same way that we would expect my friend who just keeps like putting her arm around me all the time when I say, I don't like that, to say, oh, I'm sorry that I did that. I'll try to do better next time. So it's very transferable skills. I would say that, people may make those connections and take them out of the classroom or not. But my hope is that because we are bringing that to people's attention, that they do carry that out with them, and work on impacting change, not just around gender-based issues, but around the myriad of other issues that we live with every day.
I'd like to add a specific example where Impact Chicago, which is the organization within which I teach empowerment self-defense, for years, like many other impact organizations, we would use we would say, call 911. We would say 911. And by bringing an understanding of these larger isms to our work, we found that we could no longer say that. There were too many examples of women of color, of trans women, of people, that 911 was not safety. Even though maybe for the majority of women in our class, they would never have thought about that. And so we have changed, we just say at the end, get to safety. And 911 can be one of those options, but it also creates an opportunity for us to say why we say get to safety, and that we're able to address their various, that people, depending upon the combination of identities that they have, that it makes a difference. What is a safe space? And so I feel like that's something that we've really integrated into our classes, that people indicate that they take with them.
So I'd like to raise another question that came up in this. I'm not going to say who that sent this, because a couple of people sent a very similar question. So we'll address it that way. When working in a very patriarchal community, Mormon community, or an ultra-Orthodox Jewish community, or any other community that has a very strong patriarchal system, how do you deal with the resistance of women finding their voice?
I think once again, it's about context and understanding where resistance comes from, both systemically and personally. And that as ESG practitioners, that's something we do understand and can use as many allies as we can gather to impact that system and that individual. Because we like to believe that people are not intentionally mean, they are just uninformed. And that is part of our job to help educate, to help understand where the resistance comes from, and to build pathways for people who want to go around or through that system that are safe and acceptable and will work for them. So again, different choices, different people. And I think the larger issue around patriarchal systems is the acceptance and support of empowerment self-defense in general by the systems that are not patriarchal and that are not as oppressive as some other systems. So if we can all join together to make an impact on oppressive systems, that will not be as big a barrier.
You gotta come to the mic though, because otherwise they can't hear you.
Is there currently research on empowerment self-defense having a positive impact on mental health outcomes? The things that are interesting to me, the connections that I'm making are, I'm aware that the healthcare system in Boston will pay for an 8-week meditation course because it has a health beneficial effect. And as a parent of preteens, I'm aware of the high incidence of teen suicide and people's sense of disempowerment in the face of big things like global warming or the political situation. And I know personally that anecdotally, I know that empowerment self-defense can actually help people in their wellness and their well-being as martial arts can. But do we have a way to approach the healthcare system to actually pay for this as they do for meditation?
Somebody want, I probably have a lot of people who could answer that question. Who wants to jump in?
And people are asking, because some people came in during the middle of this, if you can just say your name, who you are again before you start speaking, that would be wonderful.
Thank you for asking that question.
Say your name.
Julie Harmon, and thank you for asking that question. There is a tremendous amount of research that shows outcomes, positive mental health outcomes of empowerment self-defense. From, I think, Clara, Carmel was talking about agency, confidence, competence, perspective, using your voice, making better choices, feeling better about your body, having a different self-image, feeling empowered to live in the world in a different way. And we can provide a bibliography of the outcomes of those studies at the end of this webinar. So yes, there are tons of positive outcomes. The second part of your question is, how do we get hospitals or mental health centers, or my favorite idea is insurance companies, to support and pay for empowerment self-defense classes? And that is a question I do not know systemically how we do that. I know that there's many of us in this room who have made attempts and approaches and have sometimes been very successful. But as we were said before, if it rests on an individual and not a system, value, or principle, it becomes harder for everybody.
So the last question that has come up so far, actually going to be, I will be speaking about that in the 4th session, which is the differences between martial arts self-defense and empowerment self-defense. I'll speak about it in depth there, but I will give a one-line intro to what that session is going to be like. Martial arts, traditional martial arts, including some of the newer ones like Krav Maga and other systems of that type, are systems created by men for how men fight men. And many of the self-defense systems that have been created over the years were created by well-meaning men, male martial artists, who saw a need, or policemen, or ex-military, and have, brought, again, a mentality of the types of violence that they are used to. Empowerment self-defense is a system that's been crafted and designed and nurtured and grown by women professionals who have dedicated their lives to understanding the types of violence that women, children, people with disabilities, and the elderly, and all other vulnerable populations, LGBT, have to deal with on a daily basis. It's not just about the big scary boxer, or a physical fight. It's all of the microaggressions and all of, just as we've heard in this session. And I encourage you to join us at our 4th session for that one. Anybody else We'll wrap up. We've got 3 more minutes. So we got a comment. Okinawan karate was developed as civil defense. Correct. It was developed as civil defense for men. Predominantly, men were the ones who were fighting back in civil defense, not the women. You did have, I will give credit to where credit is due. The Naginata is a women-developed martial art that was using rice poles because that's what they had to defend themselves. So it's not 100%, it is a generalization, but it is pretty darn good. You know, most of the fighting was not done by women, most. All right, so we look forward to seeing you at the next session, and have a nice break.